Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
The Labour Party is 20 points ahead in the polls and looks set to form the next UK government. But how will their economic, tax and spending plans impact investors?
We look at the promises included in Labour's manifesto and what was left unsaid. And in today's dumb question of the week, why are capital gains taxed at a lower rate than income? All right, let's get into it. So as we record this on Monday the 17th of June, it looks like the Labour Party is the next government in waiting. Now, we sometimes get comments, don't we, saying, oh, you guys are too harsh on the Conservative government, they're doing their best, stuff like that. And we should say here, we're not assuming that Labour's going to be the next government. It just looks likely, so that's where we're going to focus our attention today. We're not here to bash the government or to make them look like incompetent fools. They do a good enough job of that themselves. Now, let's come on to Labour. So you did a video, didn't you, at the weekend, which did a really good job of breaking down some of the key manifesto commitments they've made. What was your sort of top-level takeaway of what they're promising?
The way I see it, they've kind of handcuffed themselves by having to say that they'd be business friendly, but also not increasing debt to GDP ratios above the roughly 100% that we're at now. And pretty much having the same goal as the Conservative Party, which is to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by the fifth year of their forecast. So, I think there's very limited amounts of stuff they can do just to get growth kickstarted again. And they've been so cautious that it's pretty clear that this manifesto that they've come up with is just a get elected manifesto. It's not a radical tear everything up and start again manifesto.
Roman, can I say that every single political manifesto is a let's get elected manifesto? You can't always rely on them. And that's the first point to say. A lot of governing is about responding to events, right? In the last parliament, the manifestos were so unimportant because we got COVID, right? Which changed everything, changed all the spending plans and everything like that. So who knows? But we're going to have to focus on what they're telling us they're going to do. And I think you're right. They played it safe. And why wouldn't you when you're 20 plus points ahead in the polls?
But overall, I think it was a positive manifesto in the sense that they didn't really do anything too offensive, I think, for investors. So that's really what I care about. They're not going to touch ISAs, at least not initially. They're not going to reintroduce lifetime allowance, which is something they were talking about. So this is the amount that you can invest in your pension over your lifetime. And there was a limit, which was just over £1 million. And that was scrapped by the Conservatives. And there was talk that Labour were going to bring it back in.
I mean, they said they were going to bring it back in. So that's where the talk came from.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, the Financial Times reported that they've abandoned that and the lifetime allowance won't be coming back. But it's not in the manifesto. It's not a manifesto commitment.
No, that's right. I think what was interesting is the FT said that it was someone close to Rachel Reeves. Okay, so
that almost always means it's Rachel Reeves.
Rachel Reeves, yeah. So that's the way they leaked it. And I think it was all about disruption. So they said, yes, the legislation to bring it in was flawed. There were mistakes in the legislation, which I think is actually true. And that caused confusion, which they're going to sort out. So really, this is about not rocking the boat. And I think that's a good place to start. But what really worries me is what happens next. When they get into power, what's the next step going to be?
That worries you? Are you really worried right now? To me, it seems like they are genuinely handcuffed by the fiscal constraints here. We have a lot of debt as a country relative to the recent past. And we have recently experienced turmoil in the bond market around a bad budget. So I think they probably aren't going to do anything too radical, are they? At least not to begin with.
What I mean by being worried is I think what often happens is they get into power, they've got certain things which they want to achieve. And the excuse is, oh, it's much worse than we thought. You thought the economy was in a bad state. Well, actually, it's worse than that. And we have to do something to kind of turn it around. And that means other taxes, or it means raising debt in the debt market. So that could cause instability. And that's my worry, that they're going to turn around and really revert back to old Labour.
What was kind of curious to me about the Labour manifesto was that it did quite a good job of diagnosing the problems we face as a country. Like on health, it goes, oh, we've got record waiting lists, and the health service is really creaking. But then it promises like quite underwhelming things like, oh, we're going to boost the number of MRI scanners in the health service. Okay, is that going to do much? And then on schools, it says, there's a massive gap between different schools. A lot of teachers are struggling at the moment, huge workloads. And then it promises an expansion of free breakfast clubs. Is that going to solve the problem? And I think this is just a demonstration that the fiscal situation is what it is. And they can't make huge spending commitments, at least without promising big tax rises. And they've ruled out raising any of the big major taxes, like income tax, national insurance, VAT, corporation tax, all of those things they've said they're not going to touch.
So look, the fiscal drag thing, where you don't raise the tax thresholds despite people earning more, that effectively taxes people more, that's probably going to stay in place. And that's going to give them some of a boost, some degree of increase in income over time.
That's already budgeted in, though. That's in the numbers already.
Yeah, that will not surprise anyone. And it's like you say, it's a known thing. I think the one growth thing which they could have done, which would have made a big boost, is renegotiating the trade deal with Europe. And that's something that was in the FT today, for example. So Rachel Reeves said, we would look to improve our trading relationship with Europe and do trade deals around the world, she said.
That sounds like the thing everyone says.
Yeah, exactly. And she said that they'd reset Britain's global image. But I thought she made a good point here, which is about the particular changes they're going to make. One of them is for financial services and making sure that qualifications in the UK are recognised in Europe. So passporting those services out to Europe will become easier. And the other point was about chemical regulations, which I thought was a funny one. She says, I don't think anyone voted leave because they were not happy that chemicals regulations were the same across Europe. When my constituency voted to leave, it was purely because of immigration.
True, I think. But the thing you're missing, I guess, is that these things have to be negotiated with the EU. We can't just unilaterally say we're going to harmonise chemical regulation and we're going to make the EU recognise our professional services qualifications. And I don't think there's much appetite in Europe right now for reopening any kind of trade discussions with us.
Yeah, that's going to be a difficult negotiation. And they absolutely said that one of the red lines in the negotiations would be no rejoining the single markets or the customs union. So again, no radical changes that would boost growth. And I think that would have been one that probably could, without costing a huge amount of money. But of course, I think initially they're going to have the political capital to do things. Later on, they're going to be in a quagmire of internal disputes and all sorts of other problems that will probably surface at some point.
I don't hold up much hope for major changes with our trading relationships. But we need growth. And if we're not going to get it from new trading relationships, where's it going to come from? And the Labour Party have made a number of promises and recommendations that they think will boost growth.
I think the good one, the one which I kind of agree with and which they can just get by default, is stability, as long as they don't go off the rails early on, and sort of go populist, which frankly I don't think this leadership would. I think the stability angle is a good one, not replacing the Prime Minister every 6 months or so, not having crazy budgets.
6 months? What did Liz Truss last? 42 days or something, wasn't it?
Oh, I love that lettuce. But also things which help businesses plan. Having 2 budgets every year, that means difficulty for businesses, because if corporation tax is changing, you can't make plans. And, always changing the goalposts in order to tweak something and get re-elected. That was really difficult, I think, for UK businesses. And so stability there would be very welcome in terms of policy. One fiscal event per year, I think, is a really good idea. And signalling what's going to happen before it happens, that's even more important.
And what do you think about the return of industrial strategy, really? It's something we've not really seen in the UK, I guess, since the 70s, where the government's in the business of putting together a national wealth fund, as Labour calls it, and a new industrial strategy. And they've actually started to lay out some priority areas where this might invest. Things like batteries and steel and ports.
Yeah, it just reminds me of British Volt and just how embarrassing that collapse was. Having these kind of big schemes where the government tries to do something and then tries to get private companies to come on board. But I'm just worried that we're going to see a repeat of that, and there isn't going to be this crowding in effect, which is what they describe in the manifesto. It's actually run a mile effect, because anything which involves the government, you just think, oh God, I just don't want to be involved with that.
Maybe. I think they had to do something, though, because industrial strategy has come back on the menu in America in a big way with their Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. And now in Europe as well, there's schemes to try and reshore some manufacturing. So I think if Britain didn't do anything, we would be a big outlier.
Yeah, I think it just doesn't really play to our strengths. Things like the creative industry, for example, movies, that's something we're really good at and successful at financially. Financial services, nobody likes bankers, but it's something we're really good at and it makes lots of money. But they're focusing on weird things like the steel industry, where we're not so competitive. Maybe that's for strategic reasons, I'm not sure.
Well, they have to keep the unions happy as well. And people would argue that steel manufacturing has a national defence importance, so you don't want to completely lose that capacity.
Yeah, and maybe we do want to kind of broaden our skill base and employ people who aren't traditionally going to be in the knowledge industries. And that also plays to Labour's historical group of support, if you like, their demographic. And it'll probably keep the unions quieter.
I mean, I guess the thing to say here is that the scale of what we're talking about in terms of infrastructure investment and industrial strategy is quite a lot smaller than in the US, for example.
Yeah, you look at the amount they're spending on the Inflation Reduction Act, it's 10 times as much as the UK. And, that's maybe because it's spread over a longer period of time. I think it's a decade, whereas this is talking over the next parliament. But still, the incremental change is absolutely tiny. So that's how I opened the video, which was to say that the new revenue, which they've identified, is 7.4 billion. But that's only a 0.7% increase in receipts for the UK, because our total receipts in 23-24 were 1.1 trillion. So tiny, tiny changes.
And the spending's forecast to go up by roughly the same amount, a bit less, I think.
Yeah, 0.4% of receipts. So, almost insignificant, hardly any change at all.
I mean, maybe one point to make there about increased revenue is that I think around 5 billion of that 7 is forecast to come from closing tax avoidance loopholes, as every government says. So whether you can rely on that, I don't know. But it's in every manifesto for every election.
But you can almost hear the people at HMRC rolling their eyes collectively thinking, oh, no, not again. It's not like they don't try.
I know. If it was so easy to do, we'd have done it already. I mean, just to go back to growth, because that is the theme that runs throughout the manifesto. The mission, as Labour says, is to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7, which is a fine mission. That would be amazing if we could do that and would go a long way to solving a lot of the country's problems. And we do need growth. We really need growth right now. Because you look at the manifesto and you say, do the sums add up, right? That's always the cliche. Do the sums add up? The income versus the spending. And they do on paper, right? But that's not accounting for massive cuts that would have to take place in non-protected areas of public services. So if you exclude health and education, all the other public services would have to see massive austerity to make these plans add up in any of the manifestos. That's just what's implied by the public finances right now. The IFS has done some great work on this. And that doesn't really seem credible that a Labour government would push through huge real-term cuts to the justice system or whatever it might be.
And I think those are already priced in. I think that's already assuming that those cuts are going to happen, these forecasts. So that's going to be very difficult to square with the left wing of the Labour Party. So I think there are certain forces which could cause these centripetal effects within their own party, which essentially will make things much more difficult down the line to pass legislation.
If you look at the interviews that various shadow ministers have given over the last few weeks, they all come back to growth as what's going to square this circle, if you like, and bail us out and stop us having to do these rounds of austerity. They believe that they can get higher growth than what's budgeted by the OBR, which would mean they wouldn't have to implement austerity measures in public services. That's probably a dangerous assumption because, at least over the last few years, growth has tended to disappoint on the downside.
I think the one ray of light is the business investment in the UK, which really has not recovered since the Brexit referendum in 2016. And if there was more certainty about industrial policy, for example, maybe that would drive greater business investment, which could generate growth. But I think something's got to give it a little bit of a kickstart. Maybe it'll come from planning reform. That's one of the things they're talking about. That doesn't directly cost anything. But that certainly has been a brake on new investment in the UK.
To me, that's the biggest thing that the government needs to get going. We need to be able to build stuff. You can't get growth when it's so hard to build houses, infrastructure, and industry. I was reading the other day that a big data center has been turned down by planning authorities. And you think, oh, where was it? Was it in some like beautiful, bucolic countryside? No, it was literally right next to the M25, I think. It's in an industrial estate. Like, why is this happening? But we're in a strange position as a country because we need to raise more revenue, probably. And so we need more taxes, but we want others to pay. And we know that we need more houses, but we want them built somewhere else. We're in this constant tension with ourselves. We know what needs to be done, we just don't do it.
Yeah, and all of this stuff takes time. So my other concern is that they're going to do some of this stuff. The payoff won't be immediate, and then the pushback will start. And essentially they won't be able to have any new reforms.
You know what could be, weirdly, a burden for them is if they get a huge majority with a lot of rural seats, which typically the Labour Party wouldn't have. It would be concentrated on urban areas, and therefore it's much easier to reform the planning system to build in the Greenbelt or wherever, if you haven't got your own MPs saying, this is my constituency.
Yeah.
So weirdly, if they go and win 400, 500 seats, they're going to have a lot of internal opposition, probably, to planning reform.
Things like the grid, people just don't want those pylons in their back garden because it's horrendous. They are awful to look at. Laura's got a kind of phobia of very large metal structures. I didn't know that was a thing until I knew Laura, my partner. And yeah, apparently pylons are terrifying for some people.
Half of the country, I think, if you look at what's being built.
I kind of like pylons.
We're going to need them, aren't we?
But look, if you want infrastructure where we've got houses with solar power, we've got wind energy, we've got cars that can feed energy back into the grid and effectively forming a massive battery so you can store renewable energy. All of this stuff requires that kind of really unpopular development. And they're just going to have to be really brutal, I think, when it comes to planning. And there will be huge pushback.
Starmer said he's prepared to make enemies, and he will need to if he wants to do this. The government's promising to build 1.5 million homes over the course of the next parliament, and that would be around double the rate we've seen in the last year or two.
That'll be difficult, and particularly around where I live, because this is kind of greenbelt land. Lots of wealthy people live here in Buckinghamshire.
And you.
And me, obviously, very wealthy. And they don't like development locally. But it is beautiful around here. It's green, it's pleasant, unless you live in Wickham, of course. So I think this will be the shortest honeymoon period, one of the shortest that we've seen for some time.
It's because the problems are real. It's not just bad governance. It's that we face genuine problems that are hard to solve.
And you've got to remember that we've just come out of almost war footing. I think that's the way to describe it with COVID, where debt to GDP has been pushed up massively and we had to spend in order to soften the blow, which we did pretty well, but not as well as the United States in the sense that, our growth generating policies didn't come with COVID. It was mostly so people could pay their gas and electricity bills and these furlough schemes, which the Americans didn't do. They actually were quite happy for people to be fired and for unemployment to spike and then very quickly recover, which is what happened. And then their fiscal stimulus has been very much based on rebuilding their manufacturing base. Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and the lowest FX fees on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Not ready to invest? Trading 212 has recently launched an attractive flexible cash ISA with interest paid daily. Customers can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which offers 1.5% cash back on all transactions until October the 1st, 2024. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 account and make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code RAMIN, RAMIN, or the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Other fees may apply. Interest applies on the uninvested cash in your account. Free shares can be fractional. Terms apply.
One of the challenges we face in terms of building is that maybe we just don't have enough skilled labour to build houses and infrastructure as quickly as we'd like.
And you've got pushback from the oligopoly, which is essentially 8 house builders, which don't want you to build more houses because it pushes down prices if you increase supply.
How do you think a Labour government might affect investments in house builders and the stock prices of Taylor Wimpey and all of those guys?
Well, they've already had a boost previously with schemes like Help to Buy. They were the primary benefits of that scheme. And it looks like we are going to get some kind of mortgage guarantee scheme again from Labour for first-time buyers.
Yeah.
So, that's going to help them. And also the companies that feed into them. So things like Brickability, which is a company that makes bricks in the UK, that's an obvious one. And companies that produce glass and all of the stuff that goes into making a house. That's obviously going to benefit them. And then beyond that, maybe there'll be some help for the banks because they have to finance these purchases with mortgages. So as long as they're careful with the spending, that could be good for them. And if the government's taking some of the risk on the loans, of course, it helps them. So I think those are the direct beneficiaries.
Also, the energy sector is an interesting one because one of the revenue-raising measures that Labour is going to impose is to extend the existing windfall tax on oil and gas companies.
Some of them are multinationals. So, for example, BP generates a lot of its revenue from abroad. So only 19% of their revenue comes from the UK. And for Shell, it's just 14%. So I think those companies were pretty much unscathed for good reason. Whereas if you look at domestic oil and gas companies, something like Harbour Energy, their revenue is almost exclusively UK-based. 94% comes from the North Sea.
And they have suffered since the Labour manifesto was published. I think they're down around 8% as a stock price.
Yeah, I mean, this was a sector that was already beaten up by lower energy prices anyway. So it's hard to tease out the difference between Labour's policy and what the energy price is doing. But yeah, certainly for that one, it took a blow.
But then for the renewable sector, maybe there's an upside if Labour is going to accelerate the adoption of clean energy.
Yeah, and it's always surprising how much of the energy for the UK is generated by renewables. There's a brilliant website called National Grid Live, and it tracks in real time what the energy sources are for the national grid in the UK. And for the past year, about a third of the energy, 38%, has come from renewables, with wind making up 32% of that. So that's incredible, I think. So people just forget how much of a transition we've already made in the UK and how large a sector this is.
The last week's worth of weather makes me think, yes, wind energy will do well, solar will do badly in the UK.
Well, solar's still tiny for the UK, and I think it always will be because, we just don't get much sun. But I think domestic solar, that could be really big. Particularly if you've got an electric car, I think it all makes sense. You couldn't have oil pumps and refineries in your back garden, but having a couple of solar panels on your roof, pretty easy.
I mean, if you are a homeowner, maybe there was some relief that Labour says there's not going to be capital gains tax on your house. Don't worry about that. But then capital gains taxes more broadly are not mentioned in the manifesto and are not part of those ring-fenced things like income tax and national insurance where they promise not to raise them. So there's obviously a lot of questions like, are they going to raise capital gains tax rates?
There are so many taxes which they could increase, which weren't mentioned in the manifesto. So it's almost like you have to read between the lines to see where they could increase their revenue.
Obviously, the capital gains tax allowances have come down steadily over the last few years, such that I think there's only £3,000 now per year as an allowance. But the tax rates are significantly below income tax. And as a more left-wing party, they look at that and think, oh, maybe that benefits the richer members of society. So there's going to be a push internally, I think, within Labour to bump those rates up a bit. Whether they actually do it, who knows?
So yeah, the Labour Party is not going to like capital gains. That's not traditionally something which they would try to favour.
And remember, we do have ISAs and pensions, which you can shelter a lot of investment where you never have to pay capital gains tax on it anyway.
And it is true that if you get a certain income in retirement, you can generate that with lower overall taxes than you could if you're a working person. Because if you've got an ISA, that can churn out cash tax-free, and that's a huge benefit. Then you've also got pretty generous allowances. But generally, I think the way people feel about these things is it's okay to tax the rich as long as they're richer than me. That's what people really care about. So if it's 10 million plus, yeah, fine, yeah. Have at it.
Until I earn 10 million, and then, then the richer 20 million.
Yeah, it's a sliding scale. So I think that as long as they get the numbers pitched about right, then it's not going to be difficult to make it a popular policy, or at least an acceptable policy.
The trouble is, if you look at how tax revenues have changed over the last 10, 15 years, the gains have come from taxing the rich more. It's unpopular to say that, but that's where the money has come from. And you can only get so much out of the rich. This is the thing. If you narrow the tax base too much, then you can't raise enough revenue to fund the public services. And the cliche about the British electorate is always that we want to pay American tax rates and expect European services. Maybe people would say it's gone the other way, right? We're starting to pay European taxes and we've got American services right now.
That's the way it feels, isn't it? And if you just look around at infrastructure, it does seem to be creaking. And the things that people notice, the roads and potholes and trying to get a GP appointment.
It's a difficult thing to ask people to pay more in tax and get less back from it. But we face these structural challenges around an aging population, for example, where that is going to kind of be the case for a little while. And the other thing people often highlight is that public sector productivity doesn't look great. I mean, it's a hard thing to measure, though, because how do you measure output versus hours worked for public sector when it's not all about money? And sometimes I often think, do we even want better productivity in the public sector in some ways? Like, there's obvious things where you do, like you want the administration to be efficient and stuff like that. But if you look at schools, well, the obvious way to increase productivity is to cram more kids into the same classroom, right? So a teacher is teaching more students. That's a productivity enhancement, but it's not something we really want. Similarly, if you go to the doctor and they just have 5-minute appointments, they're going to see more patients. That's good for productivity. But is that what you want when you use the health service? So I always think this productivity debate is slightly misguided with the public sector.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in terms of revenue generated per unit time, then it is a weird thing to talk about productivity for the public sector.
Like, I'm not saying there aren't efficiencies to be had. There obviously are. It's just that with repeated rounds of austerity in real terms cuts over the years, there's not much meat left on the bone to cut in a lot of departments.
Now, one thing that does worry me in its absence from the manifesto is anything to do with ISAs. So they didn't say they were going to have some kind of cap on ISAs. That's always my worry. Or that they're going to screw them up in some way. They did talk worryingly about pensions and forcing pensions to invest in the UK and its infrastructure, which I always think is a big mistake.
Yeah. But it's hard as a government. We've said how little spare cash there is to go around. And they look at the pensions industry and think, wow, look at all that money just sitting there, largely invested abroad. Maybe we could use some of that.
Yeah, it is tempting. And I think they probably will. And they've said they will. So they talk about greater productive investment for UK PLC from pensions, workplace pensions. And also they're going to undertake a review of the pensions landscape to consider further steps needed to improve pension outcomes, fine, and increase investment in UK markets, not so fine.
It's all very vague. It's going to go through consultations and reviews, and we'll see where we end up. Just while we're on pensions, they obviously committed to supporting the pensions triple lock. It would have been a bit of a landmine set up for them to trip on if they didn't say that. We know that long term it's going to have to go at some point.
It will, yeah.
Now doesn't seem to be the time. We said earlier that the lifetime allowance for pensions is not going to be reintroduced, though that's not actually a commitment in the manifesto, just something that's been leaked. But there are other aspects of pensions that they could fiddle with if they want to raise more revenue. So they could change the tax relief you get when you're paying into your pension. At the moment, it's at your marginal tax rate. They could also start to wither away the tax-free lump sum that you can withdraw in retirement. At the moment, it's around 25% of what the old lifetime allowance was. But now it's a hard number in legislation, which means it's subject at least to fiscal drag over time if they don't increase it. And maybe the big one is that pensions are really efficient when it comes to avoiding inheritance tax. They don't form part of the estate. That would seem something that Labour might look at. We're just guessing, right? None of these things have been said, but there are things you can do on pensions which aren't related to the lifetime allowance and the triple lock.
Yeah, there are so many taxes they could increase. So I think there is scope for them to do that, and I think they probably will. And they'll have to. The revenue is going to have to come from somewhere.
In terms of what we do as investors, I always think it's impossible to predict this stuff. As I said earlier, events are going to shape policy as much as anything, and the world is unpredictable. All we can really do is make the most of the tax allowances we have at the time we have them. Fill your ISA every year if you can, put as much money in your pension as you can, and diversify your risk, I guess, across different types of account.
Yeah, you could argue that anything which gives you a tax benefit up front is going to be better than something which might offer the tax benefit later on, because that's going to be less subject to political risk. I doubt they'll claw back previous tax benefits. So, the benefit you get from putting money into your pension now is probably a valuable thing. The amount you can put into your ISA is probably a valuable thing. But, I'm concerned that they're going to cap the ISA and say, look, anything above 1 million is going to be, just like SIPs used to have, is going to incur some additional tax, right? It won't be tax-free beyond that.
It's interesting that the Resolution Foundation, which is a left-wing think tank, kind of influential, I guess, in the Labour Party behind the scenes, they were pushing for a £100,000 cap on the tax benefit from ISAs. I think it's a difficult one for the government to bring in. ISAs are quite straightforward and well understood. And it's not going to raise a huge amount of revenue if you start doing that stuff. You'll annoy a lot of people for little gain.
And I think they should be encouraging people to save, because that'll mean less expenses for them later on when people might become dependent on the state rather than using their own savings.
All right, just to finish here, if we are going to get a Labour government next month, what are your big hopes and maybe fears that could play out over the next Parliament, over the next 5 years?
Well, I guess my primary hope is that the UK stock market, which is actually doing okay at the moment, will carry on doing well. And also that we'll become, rather than some kind of pariah market, something that people would be willing to invest in, even if they weren't based in the UK. So foreign investment in the UK market. I think that would be great. And I think that could also help kickstart growth. If capital were more easily available here and people were willing to invest in that from abroad.
Yeah, I second that. Growth, both of the economy and the stock market, would be a great thing and something we dearly need. And it would help so many aspects of British society. Like, you could fund public services better, people can get sustainable pay rises, companies can be more profitable. All of that's so hard if you don't have growth.
My main worry, I think, is that this party is going to fall apart, and it'll be because people don't support Starmer and the new, shiny, business-friendly approach that they've got. That could fall apart quite quickly, I think. And then we move back to policies which involve confiscating wealth, high taxation, lots of spending, all the usual stuff which people are scared of from the Labour Party. How much have they really changed their spots? How about you, Michael?
Well, I guess I would consider it a successful parliament if they build some houses, get a bit of growth, and ideally simplify the tax system. I think the British tax system is incredibly complicated, and it's because loads of exemptions and thresholds have accumulated over the years as governments try to patch on and mollify different parts of the electorate. And you've got this weird thing when you look at income tax where it goes up, and then you got a 62% rate between 100 and 125k. And it's like, the graph makes no sense. I was talking to my friend who's a software developer, and he says it's similar when you're building operating systems. Like, you'll over time build up this code base, which is incredibly complicated and you can't really work it. And then at some point you have to say, right, stop. Let's have a release where we just fix the bugs. I'd love that. Let's just fix the bugs in the tax system. And that might help growth in itself, because you won't get people thinking, it's not worth me taking on more work and being taxed at 60, 70% on it.
Interesting. You know, we used to have something in software development when I worked in it called refactoring. And that was even more scary, where you literally rip out the guts and just hope to hell that it wouldn't completely crash the system. Unfortunately, we're the beta testers. Now, taxation is something that's really complex, as we discussed, and a big topic of conversation in the PensionCraft community. If you want to hear what our community says about it and tips for each other, then why not join us by going to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership.
All right, today's dumb question of the week is, why are capital gains taxed at a lower rate than income? So in the UK, the capital gains tax rate you pay depends on a lot of things and what asset it is. But broadly speaking, it's 20%, which is lower than you would pay on income, which would be like 40% if you're a high rate taxpayer.
Now, interestingly, this was first introduced in 1965 by the Chancellor, which was James Callaghan at the time. And apparently the aim was to prevent the skillful manipulator, in quotes, from avoiding tax by reframing income as capital gains.
Yeah, that was the first capital gains tax in the UK. And then interestingly, in the late 80s, the Conservative Chancellor Nigel Lawson did actually align capital gains tax rates with income tax, although capital gains tax was indexed to inflation at that time. And then since then, we've seen different changes whereby capital gains tax rates have fallen. So they're significantly below income tax rates now. Is there a justification for this? Because on the face of it, if you're someone who doesn't earn capital gains, you think, well, why am I paying 40% when some rich guy's paying 20% on what's effectively the money he's using to live on?
There are justifications for why you'd want a lower rate on capital gains than on income. One of them is the way in which you earn. Usually the capital gains will come in lumps, big lumps, whereas income comes gradually over time.
Okay, so if you were taxing capital gains purely as income, then the effective rate over your lifetime would be much higher than income because, yeah, it's coming in one big bunch and you don't get as many allowances on it. Kind of makes sense.
Another reason why people might pay capital gains is if you're holding an investment outside an ISA or a SIP and you want to sell something in order to buy something else. Let's say you just want to de-risk, for example. You'd sell some of your risky investments, buy some bonds, say, then that's going to incur a tax. So essentially what you're doing is removing flexibility from investors and making them invest suboptimally. And I'm not sure that's the outcome you want.
It is effectively a transaction tax at that point, isn't it? And it's not even if you want to de-risk necessarily. It could be that, let's say you've invested in one company 10 years ago, it's done really well, stock's gone up, you made a good investment. You allocated capital well. Well done. But now, maybe you've identified another company that you think is going to grow really strongly. Like economically, as a society, we should want you to go and allocate your capital there and give them the funds to grow. That benefits everyone, I guess, in the round. But if you're going to be paying a massive rate of capital gains to sell that first investment you did well on to buy the second one, it raises the bar for you to do that. And therefore, in theory, raises the cost of capital for early stage companies, I guess, would be an argument.
Yeah, I mean, there are incentives for those companies, things like venture capital trusts, also enterprise investment schemes. So there are ways of providing capital for early stage companies. But for that huge pool of capital that's invested outside ISAs and SIPs, you're right. I think this is essentially a transaction tax.
Yeah, it creates a lock-in effect, which is undesirable economically speaking. That's not to say you don't want it politically. You don't purely have to design the rules of society based on what's economically efficient. But just from an economic perspective, it has drawbacks.
And I think making the UK attractive for people to come here and live and invest, I think that's a good thing. And if our rate of tax is punitive compared to other countries, that's a problem. And some countries have very little capital gains tax.
Or no capital gains tax. I don't think Switzerland, for example, or New Zealand have capital gains taxes.
So Switzerland doesn't have a capital gains tax, but it does have a wealth tax. So it's slightly different. But if you look at Belgium, for example, it's quite a weird outlier. It's got 0% capital gains tax, but 60% tax on employment income. So huge difference between the two.
That creates a huge incentive to be a skillful manipulator, as Callahan might have put it, and classify your income as capital gains.
Great business for investment banks if you have structured products that convert one into the other.
I think maybe the justification that makes most sense to me of why you might not want the same rate of tax on income and capital gains is that capital gains are a fundamentally different thing because you're taking on risk, unlike income. You might make an investment and lose money on it, and the government isn't going to refund you the negative tax it would have charged on that. You can offset losses and gains, but that's a slightly different thing. So to incentivize you to take risk, maybe you need a preferential tax rate.
Yeah, you're never going to have your employer asking for money back. So in that sense, you don't take a risk with income. But certainly on an international scale, if you take things like national insurance and social benefits into account, the UK is pretty standard. You compare us with other countries, and we're pretty much in the middle of the pack.
It's roughly true on capital gains tax as well. If you look across the landscape, they vary hugely. You get some countries with 0, and you get some countries in Europe where it's much higher, like France. But kind of 20s in the middle somewhere. And you don't want your tax system to be too out of step as a major economy with the other major economies. And also, there are economic theories which do argue that capital gains taxes should be low, or ideally 0, like the optimal rate, according to some influential papers, is 0%. And that's because they conceptualize capital income as future consumption. So if you're taxing capital gains, you're basically creating a bias towards present consumption over future consumption, and therefore why would people invest, or at least it disincentivizes investment. So I think the key paper here is the Chalmley Judd zero capital income tax result, which economists bang on about from the mid-80s. But still, I think we know that there are potential downsides to having higher capital gains taxes, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. This is a policy choice, and all policies have upsides and downsides. What would probably be a mistake is to equalize capital gains taxes and income taxes if you don't reintroduce the indexation, as in if you don't account for inflation, because otherwise you're just taxing people on inflation with a capital gains tax, which is a wealth tax then.
But I think for UK investors, we've got such generous tax schemes with the ISAs and the SIP. You can put away 20,000 in the ISA, you can put away up to 60k in the SIP. And then if you're a couple, you double that. So I think, it's pretty generous in the UK. So I don't really want to complain about our taxation system for investors, which I think is pretty good on a global scale.
Yeah, to pay capital gains tax, you've got to have capital gains, and we should be so lucky. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Do send us your questions, no matter how dumb, at the email address mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.